Welcome to a new history of Old San Antonio. Episode 20, San Antonio on the Brink. I'm Brandon Seal.
Oh, my city, San Antonio. Tonight I'm looking at your lovely life.
Frederick Law Olmsted was among the world's first landscape architects. Originally from New England, he worked first as a journalist before stumbling into a career that would see him design Central Park in New York City, Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and hundreds of other parks, campuses, and public places across the United States. And yet in all his travels to American cities young and old, one place stood out for him, for its setting, its, quote, odd and antiquated foreignness, and its, quote, singular composite character. San Antonio in 1856 comprised an irregular polygon whose northwest corner sat at the intersection of the future Jackson-Keller and Vance-Jackson roads, from which it ran southwest along the line later known as Callahan Road, around the future site of Port San Antonio, back northeast up Somerset-Nogalitos Road, then due east-northeast beneath the future Lone Star Brewery, over to where Commerce and Houston Streets meet up on the east side, then back northwest to join up with Hildebrand where it hits North New Braunfels, and from there, more or less along the trajectory of Jackson-Keller, back up to its northwest corner. Of course, most of the lots within these limits still boasted their own gardens and corrals, giving the town a distinctly rural and agricultural flair. And note that all four of the southern missions were excluded from these city limits, and they remained relatively independent, self-governing communities. This allowed them to preserve some of their unique flavor, though it also meant that they were slower to develop. In 1856, Olmsted arrived in San Antonio from the northeast, and first sighted its rooftops from the hill that would later house Trinity University. In the northern part of the city, he passed through new German neighborhoods with tidy orchards and garden plots and single-story houses made from local limestone with continental woodworking finishes. Pushing south into the city proper, he passed through the Anglo-American neighborhoods with their planed lumber houses and picket fences, which pressed down upon the Irish Flats neighborhood north of Alamo Plaza. Passing through the city's center, he entered Laredito, or Little Laredo, as the Tejano neighborhoods to the southwest became known. The city center itself was a jumble of tongues and ethnicities, a, quote, picturesque admixture of sallow Yankees, bearded Germans, and sauntering Mexicans, end quote, just to name a few. Laws and street signs were printed in English, German, Spanish, and sometimes French as well. And poet Sidney Lanier, 20 years later, would observe how these signs, quote, unconsciously satirized, end quote, the three cultures. One such sign read, "Walk your horse over this bridge, or you will be fined. Schnelles Reiten über diese Brücke ist verboten. Anda despacio con su caballo o teme la ley." The American warning appeals to the pocketbook, Lanier noted. The German need only know that it is forbidden. And the, quote, Mexicano, as Lanier called him, is vaguely threatened in terms of, quote, the law, end quote. Which is not to say that any of the laws in San Antonio of this period were particularly well observed. Not a week went by where there wasn't a murder or gunfight in the paper, and indeed, these were so common that they often went unremarked. In Olmsted's words, quote, if neither antagonist is seriously injured, they drink together on the following day, and the town waits for the next excitement, end quote. San Antonio's historic plazas were the focus of commercial life, and served as a melting pot, or perhaps more aptly, a chili pot. During these years, local vendors, primarily women, set up stands daily in the Plaza de Armas, or Military Plaza, where they offered soldiers, traders, and locals a regional specialty. Large chunks of beef and fat slow-cooked in pots over mesquite fires and seasoned with chiles and other spices. Think of them as San Antonio's first food trucks. Visitors were enchanted by these so-called chili queens, both for the dish that they served, as well as by the, quote, dark-eyed beauties, end quote, who served it. When night fell on the plazas, the fandangos and serenades began. Fandango taxes remained a principal source of municipal revenue, and there were typically 3 or 4 each night. Olmsted describes them, quote, at these fandangos may be seen the muleteer fresh from the coast or the pass, with gay clothes and a dozen or so of silver dollars, the United States soldier fresh from the barracks, abounding in oaths and tobacco, the herdsman with his blanket and a long knife, which seems a portion of every Mexican, the disbanded ranger, rough, bearded, and armed with his huge holster pistol and long bowie knife, all dancing, eating, drinking, swearing, and carousing, end quote. Men and women would pasear around the plaza and shoot eyes at each other, quote, all by the light of torches, making a ruddily picturesque evening group, end quote. San Antonians' peculiar attitudes toward race and ethnicity were especially remarkable, even to Olmsted, who had traveled the world. To be sure, San Antonio in the 1850s had its own slave codes, with curfews, anti-loitering provisions, and other prejudicial laws directed at her small slave population, so we shouldn't romanticize this too much. Still, Olmsted was surprised to note that San Antonians, quote, consort freely with Negroes, making no distinction from pride of race, end quote, though we can appreciate it as the unsurprising artifact of San Antonio's history as a mixed-race frontier town. a history that would make it possible for San Antonio to become the first town in the Old South to voluntarily desegregate its lunch counters, schools, and public transportation a century later. And by comparison to other Texas cities at the time, like nearby Austin, which twice during the same decade forcibly expelled its Tejano population, San Antonio seemed downright enlightened. The San Antonio that Olmsted found in 1856 had certainly come a long way from the devastated, quote, ruin that future President Rutherford B. Hayes described when he had visited a decade prior. As a result of renewed Comanche hostilities and 2 Mexican invasions in the early 1840s, San Antonio's population had collapsed to only 800 people by 1844, its lowest point in nearly 100 years. Many of its leading men were rotting in Mexican prisons for much of that period, while many others had fled amidst heightened ethnic tensions. Bullet holes and powder marks scarred San Antonio's crumbling buildings, and the frontier was slowly reclaiming the surrounding farms and ranches. This was the context from which San Antonians viewed the hottest topic of 1845, annexation to the United States, and they viewed it a bit differently than most other Texians. First, a major downside of annexation for San Antonians would be the removal of decision-making far, far away from San Antonio, farther away even than when they had depended on Mexico City. And if they couldn't get any assistance from their government when it was only 90 miles away in Austin, what hope did they have when it was back on the other side of the continent, seated amongst men that couldn't even conceive of how they lived out here? Second, everyone knew that annexation meant near certain war with Mexico. After the last 2 Mexican invasions of San Antonio had been turned back, albeit with some difficulty, Mexico had been inclined to at last recognize the independence of the Texian Republic. But once they heard news of Texas's flirtations with the United States, they broke off all such discussions and made it clear that they would consider annexation an act of war. And war with Mexico would put San Antonio back on the front line of potentially the largest conflict that the continent had ever seen. Third, many old San Antonians felt like annexation by the United States only confirmed what cynics had said about Texas's independence movement all along, that it was just a land grab by greedy Americans. Francisco Antonio Ruiz, mayor of San Antonio during the Battle of the Alamo and son of Jose Francisco Ruiz, a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence, felt that annexation was a betrayal of the old Republican ideals of devolved power that his father and so many other men had signed the Texas Declaration of Independence to win. And so, following in his father's footsteps, when he saw the direction that the annexation movement was going, he fled to go live amongst the Plains Indians for 5 years, where temporarily at least, men still lived according to a natural law. On the other hand, most San Antonians, including, for example, Jose Antonio Navarro, saw annexation to the United States as a godsend. It meant access to far greater resources and to a stable treasury. Attachment to the United States might actually be the best possible deterrent to future Mexican or Comanche attacks. And frankly, most San Antonians realized, war between the United States and Mexico could offer some unique commercial opportunities for San Antonians. So despite all the risks and all the uncertainty, San Antonians voted for annexation, 138 to 17. Though an overwhelming majority, it was still the second lowest margin amongst all Texas counties. Jose Antonio Navarro, back in Texas for less than a year now following his ordeal in Mexican prison, was elected to represent San Antonio at the new Texas State Constitutional Convention, a fitting assignment for a man who had been involved in drafting more constitutions than perhaps anyone on the continent at that point. He helped with Gutierrez's in 1813, the Mexican Federalist Constitution indirectly in 1824, the Coahuilan State Constitution in 1827, and the Republic of Texas's Constitution in 1836. He would go on to serve as San Antonio's first state senator as well. On December 29th, 1845, Texas joined the United States, the Stars and Stripes went up over San Antonio, and the U.S. Army occupied the old Spanish governor's palace in the Plaza de Armas to begin preparations for a war with Mexico. On January 13th, 1846, the U.S. Army departed San Antonio on its way to the Rio Grande, where Mexican forces were also massing, each asserting its claim to that merciless stretch of wild horse desert known as the Nueces Strip. Within 3 months, hostilities had commenced. It's easy to forget that the outcome of the Mexican War was by no means preordained. The Mexican army was 3 times the size of the United States' in 1846. Its officer class was superb, many of them educated in Europe and veterans now of many of Europe's wars of the period. It had modernized much of its equipment since 1836, and its artillery continued to be among the best in the world. By comparison, the U.S. Army relied heavily on volunteers, many of them self-provisioned. In particular, this U.S. Army came to rely heavily on the successor to Juan Seguin's old frontier ranging battalion, commanded now by Colonel Jack Hayes. Jack Hayes had spent the last decade in the saddle fighting Comanches and repulsing Mexican raids. He had learned well the lessons of San Antonio-style frontier warfare and had made his own contributions as well, most notably Samuel Colt's repeating revolver. Jack Hayes' unit of Texas Rangers, as they came to be known, would lead U.S. General Zachary Taylor's invasion into northern Mexico, scouting ahead of the slow-moving regular army, storming the walls of Monterrey, and routing Santa Ana at the Battle of Buena Vista near Saltillo, where General Taylor rendezvoused with another U.S. column marching down from San Antonio and also led by San Antonio scouts. Northern Mexico was, after all, familiar terrain to San Antonians, who had long depended on Monterrey and Saltillo as centers of government and commerce. Then, word came down of plans for an amphibious assault on Veracruz en route to Mexico City, to be led by General Winfield Scott. General Scott ordered that one unit in particular be reassigned from General Taylor's army, Colonel Hayes and his Texas Rangers. Colonel Hayes returned to San Antonio to reform his unit and gather more recruits. They marched out of San Antonio in early 1847 to the Texas coast and boarded a ship for Veracruz, where they disembarked in one of the U.S. Army's first major amphibious operations. Hayes and his Rangers would scout, forage, and secure General Scott's lines of communication all the way to Mexico City. Their knowledge of Spanish, their resourcefulness, and their horsemanship were invaluable. If new arrivals to Texas a decade before had to be taught to, quote, ride like Mexicans, end quote, by 1847, they had learned their lesson well. Upon entering new towns along their march to Mexico City, Hayes's Rangers would attempt to outdo each other in displays of equestrian skill, whipping their mounts through the main streets, standing up in their saddles, and putting a uniquely Anglo-American twist on the old San Antonio Carrera del Gallo. Whereas the original trick involved burying a chicken up to its head in the sand and plucking the head off the ground at a full gallop, these modern-day jinetes picked up silver dollars instead. Armed with their repeating revolvers, Hayes's Texas Rangers were also the best armed and most mobile forces in the entire U.S. Army, and they were terrifyingly effective. They earned the nickname Los Diablos Tejanos from their enemies, and you should read Rip Ford's Texas for a first-hand account of their exploits. When Los Diablos Tejanos marched into Mexico City on September 15, 1847, it was a remarkable turnabout for a people who just 11 years prior had been at real risk of extermination by the same government whose capital they now occupied. The victory was made all the sweeter by the fact that it had been won against their old nemesis, Santa Anna, who had returned to the presidency of Mexico just in time to lead it to disaster once more. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo concluded the Mexican-American War and resolved once and for all the geopolitical issues between Texas and Mexico, and of course it resolved them in Texas's favor. The border between the two states would be the Rio Grande River, though the stretch between San Antonio and the Rio Grande would remain a wild and lawless region for another half-century. And it helped to resolve some of the ethnic tension of the previous decade as well. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo expressly granted full citizenship and full rights to all Tejanos who desired them. Of the thousands of Tejanos living in Texas, only 150 declined American citizenship after the treaty. The vast majority remained, and by remaining, made clear their desire to be Americans. The fight for equal rights and equal treatment under the law was by no means over for many of these Tejanos, but from 1848 on, they voted with their feet. Even Juan Seguin returned to Texas, and by 1852 was elected Justice of the Peace in San Antonio. The wartime economy had wildly improved San Antonio's fortunes. The population of the city quadrupled in the 5 years between annexation and the 1850 census to 3,500 people. Perhaps more impressively, between 1850 and 1855, the tax base of the city doubled every single year, a truly remarkable statistic that reveals the dynamism of the decade. Vast quantities of men and supplies passed through the city during the war, and as the war ended, many of those merchants decided to take up residence in San Antonio, which they found was ideally situated halfway between the markets of Latin America and Eastern North America, but also now halfway between the markets of the Atlantic seaboard and booming California. Mule trains, sometimes 100 or more wagons long, became common sights, and Tejanos in particular came to dominate the trade. Almost half of Tejano households soon found work as teamsters, or arrieros. Texas Ranger Ben McCullough claimed that a San Antonio teamster could load a 25-mule pack train quicker than a single one of his Rangers could load his own gear, which should surprise no one who has ever seen a San Antonian fit an entire living room set in the bed of a compact pickup truck. These new trading opportunities and this new spirit of optimism prompted San Antonio businessmen to underwrite the newly returned war hero Colonel Jack Hayes to blaze a trail from San Antonio to El Paso, which was still only nominally under Texas control. It was this expedition that probably secured Texas's claim to El Paso prior to the Compromise of 1850, which saw Texas otherwise abandon its pretensions west of the Pecos River. By 1857, San Antonio was an important stop on the transcontinental overland routes regularly traveled by the Wells Fargo package service, and sat on the most promising route for a potential transcontinental railroad. San Antonio wasn't just a way station, however. It had important products to supply to new markets in the eastern United States, and especially to California, whose population was growing far more quickly than it could feed itself. Cattle drives from San Antonio became California's primary source of beef for a decade. As much as we romanticize the great cattle drives of the 1870s, those drives were primarily northward, up the Great Plains through flat, unfeatured terrain with few material rivers to speak of. By contrast, the first century of cattle drives out of Texas saw San Antonio drovers moving cattle from west to east, to markets in New Orleans or beyond, crossing every Texas river perpendicularly through thickets and piney woods. The great cattle drives west out of San Antonio in the 1850s were even more challenging. They had to cross the Rocky Mountains, survive the Great American Desert, and contend with some of the fiercest Plains Indians at the height of their power. We're talking, of course, about the Comanches. Even after the Mexican-American War, San Antonio remained the base from which Comanche power was met. Just as they always had, regular soldiers struggled to keep the Comanches at bay, and frontier defense still fell primarily to the Texas Rangers, commanded now by one of the great historians of the period, Rip Ford. In 1858, Rip Ford's Rangers and the 2nd U.S. Cavalry drove the Comanches all the way to Oklahoma in a campaign that retraced much of the same route worn by San Antonians almost exactly 100 years before on their way to the Battle of the Twin Villages. When the U.S. Cavalry began to lag, however, Ford's Rangers took the initiative for them, crossed the Red River, and attacked the Comanche force 3 times their size, killing 76 of the enemy at the cost of only 2 Rangers. When the U.S. cavalry commander, humiliated by the triumph of a bunch of untrained irregulars, reprimanded Ford for entering Oklahoma territory and operating outside his jurisdiction as a Texas Ranger, Ford responded that he had been tasked with finding Comanches, not learning geography. Yet the U.S. Army brought important resources and stability to the fight against the Comanches as well. Whereas the Rangers were still primarily a response force of volunteers that rarely remained in the field once the emergency had been addressed, the Army was able to establish and hold a line of forts to shield the principal settlements from the fiercest raids. The first line of forts ran from El Paso up through the hill country. By the 1850s, they had been pushed all the way to Brackettville, Fort Stockton, Abilene, and up to the Red River. And the U.S. Army actually expanded Spain and Mexico's old military legacy in San Antonio as well, establishing a permanent and meaningful presence in the town. It was during this period that the Army occupied the crumbling Alamo, repairing its scarred facade and adding its iconic hump. 9 years later, it would begin construction of the much larger U.S. Army Arsenal complex just south of downtown, which serves today as HEB's headquarters. Because of the ongoing battles with the Comanches and the instability of the border region, at one point, something like 1/10 of the entire United States Army was stationed in or reported up through San Antonio. The San Antonio front became a training ground for many of the men who would make their names in the upcoming Civil War. The 2nd U.S. Cavalry in particular, commanded by then Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, stationed in San Antonio, would produce 17 general officers during the Civil War. According to historian T.R. Fehrenbach, no other regiment in U.S. history has ever produced so many flag officers. And yet neither the U.S. Army, nor the Texas Rangers, nor even Samuel Colt's revolver would have so lasting an impact on the Comanche Empire as something else that came out of San Antonio in 1849. A cholera epidemic swept the town that year, killing 600 people, a quarter or so of the population. While the epidemic was raging, several unknowing Comanches had come to trade in San Antonio, as had long been their custom. When they returned to the plains, they took back with them this dreaded disease to their long-sheltered brethren, whose remoteness from European settlements had prevented prior exposure. The Comanches were defenseless against this invisible enemy. Almost half of the tribe died during the 1849 cholera epidemic. And so the truth is that as bloody as their raids still were in the 1850s, after 1849, the Comanches were really only fighting a rearguard action as their old tribal structures crumbled. It would take a decade for the Comanches to recover from the devastation of 1849, and by then they had lost valuable time and territory, and San Antonio had been removed from the front line of conflict. For the first time since she had raised the bloody banner of revolt with Father Miguel Hidalgo 40 years before, San Antonio seemed poised for a period of peace and stability, if not even prosperity. Yet it still didn't feel like an American city, because new immigrant groups kept discovering San Antonio before Anglo-Americans could quite take it over. In a previous episode, we mentioned the Irish who came right after Texas's independence, drawn to San Antonio's Catholic culture. Several of these Irish immigrants, such as Brian Callahan Sr. and Ed Dwyer, became early mayors. John Tuhig, recall, had come to San Antonio in 1830 and set up shop in Main Plaza. His business went well, and he soon transitioned from trading to lending, becoming one of the town's first quasi-bankers. He participated in the Siege of Bear, was captured in the second 1842 Mexican invasion, and then escaped from Mexican prison and made his way by ship back to Texas in 1844. During the first 1842 Mexican invasion, just prior to the arrival of Mexican forces, he had given away all of his stock to the poor in San Antonio rather than have it fall into enemy hands. That started a tradition of handing out bread to the poor each Saturday in front of his home, which has now been relocated and sits on the grounds of the Whitty Museum. The so-called breadline banker was also a devout Catholic and contributed significantly to the construction of St. Mary's Church, which opened in 1857 as the first English-language church in the city. And in the Catholic tradition, Tuhig was also a staunch supporter of education. He became one of the principal benefactors of the Brothers of the Society of Mary, whom he supported in founding a school on the east bank of the San Antonio River. Beginning in 1852 as St. Mary's Institute, the school would eventually spin off into Central Catholic High School and St. Mary's University. As this school was only for boys, an institution for women was also needed. In 1851, Magdalena de la Garza, daughter of José Antonio Garza, the designer of the original Lone Star in his 1818 Texas coin, founded Ursuline Academy. The original Ursuline Academy was designed and built by François Giraud, a French surveyor and architect who had arrived to San Antonio in 1847 and married an old Canary Islander. He would become the preeminent San Antonio architect of the 19th century and go on to build St. Mary's Church and St. Mary's University, which we just mentioned, as well as lead the restoration of San Fernando Church in 1873. Another Frenchman would, for a time, become the wealthiest man in San Antonio. Francois Guilbeault came to San Antonio in 1839 and married a Canary Islander of the old Ramon line, going back to Captain Diego Ramon of the Rio Grande Presidio. He developed a network of ox trains running to Mexico, the Gulf Coast, and back. An amateur botanist in his spare time, he actually also saved the European wine industry, thanks to his shipment of several hundred tons of Texas Mustang grapes to France during an aphid outbreak that nearly destroyed French viticulture. A third Catholic church, St. Michael's, was soon built to serve a growing Polish community, many of whom had settled in towns surrounding San Antonio, such as Panna Maria and St. Hedwig to the southeast, or Bandera to the northwest. Aside from kielbasa sausage, Poles made another significant contribution to San Antonio culture. The accordion still rings out today in Conjunto Tejano music, as San Antonians continued to adopt newcomers' customs as quickly as newcomers adopted theirs. Famine, overpopulation, and the political instability of Europe in 1848 were a strong impulse for much of this immigration. Yet the immigration was also driven by enchantment with the opportunities that abounded in this land of no winters and no taxes. Karl Hilmar Günther, for example, was a refuge from the turmoil of 1848 who had apprenticed as a millwright back in Saxony, Germany, before crossing the Atlantic. Starting in New York, he worked his way across the continent, through Wisconsin, St. Louis, and New Orleans. At any point along the way, the ambitious young German probably could have settled down and made for himself a comfortable living, yet in his own words, quote, "I cannot rest. I'm too young for that," end quote. Like De Zavala a generation before, he observed with approval Americans' zest for reading newspapers. Upon entering Texas, he commented, just as De Zavala's colleague Miguel Ramos Arizpe had, on how the frontier practice of shared self-defense contributed towards civic virtue and served to absorb new immigrants rapidly into an otherwise disparate community. Yet it was San Antonio, he pronounced upon his arrival there in 1851, quote, "where you can make money," end quote, even if he conceded that living in San Antonio was not quite so pleasant as living in more established population centers. But for people like Günther, indeed, for people like the first San Antonio settlers in 1718, like the Navarros, Veramendis, or Zambranos who came later in the 18th century, like Stephen F. Austin and other early Anglos who ventured into a strange and unfamiliar new culture, the coarseness of life in a place like frontier San Antonio was offset by one simple fact. Quoting Günther again, quote, "that it is free," end quote. We snark so easily at the word freedom today because it's been so abused by so many to advance their own self-serving ends, but we should try to remember that it clearly meant something real to the people who settled our city. It was something that they were willing to sacrifice material comfort for, and even to risk their life for. And more than just freedom of speech or freedom from arbitrary arrest, what these Germans and other new immigrants most seemed to value was the freedom the community offered from meddling in oppressive power structures. San Antonio's very location at the intersection of several different cultural traditions, and far removed from what few power structures actually existed in those days, prevented any one group from truly dominating the city or using their positions to exclude newcomers. And so while in other parts of America, Günther and other Germans had merely worked as wage laborers and had to fight their way to the front of the line on job sites just to make sure they got fed, in San Antonio, they were free to innovate, to become entrepreneurs, and to advance themselves by their own industriousness. In Günther's words, quote, "Is it really better in America than in Germany? For me, it's better for anyone who wants to work hard. Even those who were in glowing circumstances in Germany and brought plenty of money with them and then lost everything now find themselves entirely happy after having started over again and worked their way up from the bottom. These are the ones who have become Americanized and understand the advantages of living in freedom. They would not return to Germany for any price, even if everything that was lost would be returned to them," end quote. As you might imagine, once the letters of men like Karl Günther started circulating in Germany, German immigration to Texas really began to take off. Prince Karl von Solms-Braunfels organized the Adelsverein, or German Immigration Company, in 1842 and began settling its first Germans in 1846. And by the way, these were some badass cool Germans. Germany's record in the 20th century can sometimes overshadow for us Germany's record in previous centuries, the Germany of Leibniz, Mozart, and Goethe. It was the center of culture and learning in Europe for many of these years. And these new German immigrants to San Antonio brought this culture with them, along with a wide diversity of ideas and religious practices, from Catholicism to Lutheranism to freethinkers, which they could debate openly now in their new home. Between 1845 and 1860, 30,000 Germans entered Texas, 7,600 of whom settled in San Antonio, and at least as many more in the nearby hill country. In addition to the freedom they found in the San Antonio area, they were drawn to its old-world cultural familiarity, which stood in stark contrast to the more staid, puritanical American cities on the eastern seaboard. In San Antonio's nightly fandangos and serenades, Germans immediately found outlet for their passion for dancing and singing. In 1865, they organized the Beethoven Männerchor, or singing club, which continues in existence to this day. And recall, too, that San Antonio had the oldest public schools in the state, first forming them in 1811. Land set aside to support local schools by the state of Coahuila in the 1820s still supported San Antonio's 15 primary and secondary schools in the 1850s, which enrolled some 750 students, and which fit well with these new immigrants' ethos and emphasis on education. To this, Germans added a physical component, and their Turnverein clubs, called Turners for short, as in the old Turner Club on 9th Street, proliferated throughout the region, with the Turnverein Club in nearby Bernie, Texas, enduring right down through to the present day. The German presence in San Antonio grew rapidly, and they soon began to impose their natural orderliness on the town. They cleaned up the old acequias, whose misuse as open sewers had contributed significantly to the cholera epidemic of 1848-49. And they put the acequias to work. Before the arrival of the Germans, only one mill operated along San Antonio's waterways, but within a generation, dozens sprouted up. Again, the area's gentle gradient uniquely well suited for controlled water power. The most famous and enduring of these mills was founded by that immigrant whose letters we quoted earlier, Karl Hilmar Gunther. In 1859, he constructed a mill on the San Antonio River near the intersection of Main Street and South Alamo Street. His enterprise there would become Pioneer Flour Mills, the name a reminder of his enchantment with the romance of the American frontier, and by some accounts, the oldest family-owned business in the state of Texas. In 1853, cabinet maker Wenzel Friedrich took inspiration from his new home's history and most important industry and developed a style of furniture that would eventually decorate the palaces of Queen Victoria, Otto von Bismarck, and Kaiser Wilhelm, who apparently found nothing incongruous about lounge chairs made of bull's horns and deer hides sitting next to fine old-world furniture. Look up Friedrich's furniture. It's gaudy and glorious. His son would embrace the style as well, and later founded the Buckhorn Saloon, still operating on Houston Street today. In 1856, Simon Menger started a soap factory along the old Alamo Acequia. He soon started brewing beer at the same location, and by 1860, Western Brewery was the largest single enterprise in the state of Texas, and Menger beer was a staple of San Antonio life. By the 1870s, more than a dozen breweries were operating in San Antonio, almost all of them founded by Germans, including the Lone Star Brewery in 1874 and the Pearl Brewery in 1881. Yet Menger would become most famous for the hotel that he constructed over his brewery, adjacent to the Alamo. Soon known as the finest hotel west of the Mississippi River, the opulence of the Menger Hotel was a sign of the times in San Antonio. It cost the fantastic sum of $16,000 just to furnish the hotel, and what should make that all the more impressive is to remember that each piece of furniture was hauled to San Antonio by ox cart or mule train. The Menger Hotel continues in operation today, and over its 150-year history, it's played host to Sam Houston, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, O. Henry, Sidney Lanier, Oscar Wilde, Lily Langtry, and Sarah Bernhardt, and Presidents Taft, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Clinton, who, if you ask him, still raves about its mango ice cream. In 1853, the first German-language newspaper, San Antonio Zeitung, was published only 5 years after the first English-language newspaper began circulation as the Western Texan. In 1855, the first Spanish-language newspaper went into circulation, El Bejareño, published, interestingly, by a Frenchman, a mark of San Antonio's multilingualism. That same year, Germans formed the Casino Club at the corner of modern-day Crockett and Presa Streets, which would eventually become the premier social club in the city. In 1861, San Antonio Germans formed the Sons of Herman for the state of Texas, becoming one of the first mutual aid societies in the state, the forerunners of insurance companies. San Antonio's healthy climate, large military presence, and significant contingent of European-trained men of letters soon made it a center of military medicine as well. Doctors such as Ferdinand Ludwig von Herf applied the techniques that they read about in academic journals published in Vienna and Heidelberg and synthesized them with the practices developing in North America. San Antonio's frequent epidemics and war casualties also afforded these doctors ample opportunity to put to work their theories, laying the foundations for both military medicine and the biotech industries that still flourish in the city. In 1858, the German English School was founded by Friedrich Gross, an 1850 arrival who had married an old Canary Islander, partnered with Frenchman Francois Guilbeault and Irishman Brian Callahan, and started a mercantile firm that would, like John Tewig's business, morph into a proto-bank. Gross's passion for education was characteristic of these German immigrants, and the German English School would become the premier secondary school in the region. For the next half-century, it would educate the sons of old Tejano statesmen, industrious German shopkeepers, and newly arrived American ranchers in a trilingual curriculum of German, English, and Spanish. And 134 years later, the old German English School would be the spot where, fittingly for San Antonio's role as a hub of international commerce, 3 heads of state would meet to sign a document creating the largest free trade area in the world. By 1860, almost half of San Antonio's 8,235 vecinos were Germans, and San Antonio was the largest city in Texas, a distinction that San Antonio would hold despite its extreme isolation until the oil booms of the 1930s. Yet for all that they contributed to San Antonio, and for all that they shared in common with the residents of their adopted state, There was one thing in particular that the German plurality never quite came around to: slavery. These refugees from the oppressive regimes of the Old World had trouble understanding how their adopted country could offer freedom so bountifully to some men, while those same men held others in bondage. A conflict was brewing that would bring that question to the forefront and test even this frontier town's famed singular composite unity. Thank you for listening. For this episode, instead of asking you to go review the podcast, I'm going to try to incentivize you to do so. Taking inspiration from the name of episode 13, which people really seem to like, we have created a Sons of Libertad bandana for fans of the show. Go on our website, www.brandonseal.com, and check it out. It was designed by Patti Canseco, who has done all of our graphic design, by the way, and frankly, it's awesome. If you go to iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play and review this podcast, I'll send you a free bandana in appreciation, at least until I run out of them, and I only have about 50 left. Editing for this episode was provided by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering was performed by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend Noel McKay for letting us use his song, Mi San Antonio. And instead of recommending a book for this episode, I want to recommend some paintings. You all should check out the paintings by Theodore Gentiles. Gentiles was an Alsatian German who came to San Antonio during the 1840s and created a series of astonishing paintings of the San Antonio of the period. Much of the cover art for the individual episodes in this series actually feature Gentiles' paintings. And lastly, for this episode, I recommend that you go to the King William Fair this Saturday, April 28th. Located on the König Wilhelmstrasse, as it was known until World War I, when German names became unfashionable, King William is the neighborhood built by the most prosperous of these German immigrants. When originally built, each of the houses in this neighborhood had access to the San Antonio River or to the Mission Concepcion Acequia, which flowed right through the neighborhood and flowered perennially, thanks to, well, all the sewage that ran through it. It's a little gross, and I apologize for that, but this is where San Antonio's Gilded Age nobility built their houses, which still stand as stunning pieces of architecture.